I haven't done enough Ben Shapiro, right? Look at this guy. All right, let's watch an honest conversation on gender with Dr. Debra Soh. I have a feeling this is not going to be an honest conversation, but it'll definitely be a conversation.
Joining us on the line is Dr. Debra Soh. She's a sex neuroscientist, columnist, and political commentator. She has a brand new book out titled The End of Gender, Debunking the Myths About Sex and Identity in Our Society. It says very unsayable things in our modern moment. Dr. Soh, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Eric Weinstein. I want to know what that.
The myths about.
If you are genuinely interested beyond sloganeering and the eternal braid of gender, sexuality, and biology, then this book is required reading. Oh, they're so aggrieved. Okay.
Sex and identity in our society. It says very unsayable things in our modern moment. Dr. Soh, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Hi, Ben. Thank you for having me.
So why don't we start with what drove you to write this book in the first place? Obviously, one of the most contentious areas of American public life and apparently international public life is around the science surrounding gender. It has become basically unsayable to even suggest that men and women exist as biological entities and are also different in a variety of ways, ranging from brain function to the biology.
Okay, so first of all, it's not unsayable. People say it all the time. They never shut up about it, in fact. You're saying it right now. More importantly, okay, if you want to say, what was his phrase, as biologically distinct entities or something like that, or as separate biological entities. So if you want to make an interesting scientific differentiation, if you want to say that two things are of two completely different types, what you have to argue is that there is a set of qualities or properties that are sufficient for making either one a member of each type, and that all members of one type have and the others do not. This is not the case in regards to either sex or gender. We can say that, you know, what would you say are the essential defining properties of a woman? Getting pregnant, having ovaries. There are people we would consider women who don't have ovaries. There are people who we consider women who don't get pregnant, who can't get pregnant. Now, we're still able to differentiate men and women, right? We have two different words. Obviously, we're able to use the words and understand what we're talking about. But that's just because the question of whether we can distinguish two things is separate from whether they are philosophically really of two different distinct types. There isn't a set of essential properties that make up most objects that we talk about, most things that we talk about. Name, what the essential properties of a chair are, or, of any ordinary object. We can still obviously use the word chair, and we know what we're referring to most of the time. But there's a difference between being able to use a word and have other people kind of understand basically what you're talking about, and have that word refer to a totally scientific category or scientific concept that picks out one set of properties and only one set of properties. Okay, that's my spiel. Not specific to gender. You can apply that, or sex even. You can apply this to all sorts of things. Okay.
Of actual sex organs. So what drove you to write this?
The biggest motivation for me was all of the questions that I've been receiving over the years, ever since I first started writing about this issue, and that there is so much confusion. And what's really disturbing is that the information that is being purported to be scientifically accurate, the information that's actually being supported by some scientific organizations, medical organizations, even governmental policies, are not actually fact-based. They're not actually based in reality.
Or is this just going to be conspiracy? All the medical organizations, the American Psychological Association, they're all just lying. Okay. Wow.
You mentioned biology, because for whatever reason, biology is seen as hateful nowadays. So I felt it was really important to offer a resource for people, especially for parents, because
biology is not seen as hateful. Misrepresenting biology, or rather misrepresenting philosophy, because this falls under philosophy, not under biology strictly. That it's not even necessarily hateful. It's that if you're going to be dishonest about something like this, if you're going to be dishonest about, the issues surrounding gender, or the biology of gender, it suggests that the reason for you doing it it, or for the reason that you're doing it is because you have some animosity towards particular kinds of gender nonconforming people. Because we can't perceive any other reason that you would target this specific issue and be dishonest about this specific issue in particular, except for a bias against a particular types of people.
I have a lot of parents reaching out to me saying that this is in their kids' education. And when I would try to find resources for them, I would see that a lot of what's available in the last, I would say 5, even 10 years is ideologically motivated. And so I think it's really dangerous, especially to be teaching this to children.
Okay. First of all, you're also ideologically motivated. You're on a political show right now to push a particular ideology. Secondly, whether or not something is ideologically motivated does not tell us necessarily whether it's incorrect or not, right? So my reason for making this video right now, apart from my sort of abstract interest in sort of the philosophy of gender, is because I have I'm politically interested in making sure that, certain gender minorities aren't being oppressed. But that doesn't mean that the things I'm saying are incorrect. Now, the things she's going to say are incorrect, is my guess, but that's also not tied directly to her being ideologically motivated. She could be ideologically motivated and be correct. She just isn't. Okay.
We don't know any better.
So let's talk about some of the most controversial assertions by some of the, I would say, pseudo-biologists who are out there. How about the assertion that men and women are essentially social constructs? Even biology is a social construct. This is the most extreme form of the argument, that there are men with uteruses and women with vaginas. CNN the other day headlined that individuals with a cervix should make sure that they are cervically screened for cervical cancer. I have no idea.
So gender obviously is a social construct because that's just what gender means. Gender refers to the ways that we present ourselves, the way we express ourselves, what we wear, how we talk, how we carry ourselves, that are obviously social. You could argue they have a genetic root, but that hasn't been demonstrated. They would still be social constructs. Unless you want to throw out the idea of social construct altogether, gender is a social construct. Sex is a social construct, although I can understand why people quibble with the use of the term social construct when applied to sex. Sex is a social construct insofar as the physical attributes that really do exist empirically, right? Chromosomes are a real thing that exists. The fact that we group some of them together, right, like certain kinds of chromosomes, penises, vaginas, etc., we group those under one category and say this is sex. This is this new thing, this amalgamation that creates this new concept called sex. That's something we socially decided on. What I said earlier is that it's not like there are half of all people or whatever have exactly the right combination of chromosomes and secondary sexual characteristics to make them all of the same type, and the other half have the opposite or whatever. That's just not the case. So this idea of sex as this emergent property of underlying physical characteristics is something that doesn't really exist other than beyond our using a word to talk about it that we all kind of roughly understand, because roughly, obviously certain characteristics tend to go along with other characteristics. That's the way in which it's socially constructed, because we agree to talk in this way, to group things in a certain way that isn't necessarily reflective of some essential underlying reality, that isn't necessarily reflective of some thing called sex that exists on top of just collections of chromosomes and secondary sexual characteristics. I hope that makes sense. Okay.
What an individual with a cervix is, other than a woman. So do biological men and women exist? And does the existence of intersex people invalidate the notion that there are in fact two separate sexes?
So it started off
in a strictly philosophical sense, the idea that there are two sexes, yes, it does invalidate that. It doesn't in a social sense, right? There are two socially agreed upon notions of sex, however loosely defined. and then there's intersex people. But yes, in a strictly philosophical sense, it invalidates the idea of sex as a thing that exists on top of the existence of penises and vaginas and chromosomes, right? Because we see that these don't all fall along the same lines.
With gender as a social construct, which is not true, and then it's expanded to gender as a spectrum, and now it's expanded also to biological sex being both a spectrum and socially constructed, which is absolutely ridiculous. Of course, there are differences between men and women, and in terms of people for whom biology determines their gender, 99% of us, our biological sex will predict how we feel about our gender.
When you say your biology determine, like, are we talking about your genes? Because this isn't true. Gender identity is determined. I'm sure it's heavily genetic, but it also can have environmental influences.
So this does not invalidate intersex people. This does not invalidate transgender people. Intersex people, for the most part, do want to live within the gender and biological sex binary. Most of them do actually want to live as one gender or one sex or the other. And for trans people, obviously, it's just so happens that their gender is the opposite of their biological sex. But this is not to say that any of this is socially constructed.
So let's talk about the phrase that gender is a social construct. So that's been a very vaguely defined phrase.
Like the only argument I could see for this is a heavily, I don't want to say reductionist, but some kind of heavily genetic reductionist argument where you'd say, well, there are no social constructs because everything we do is ultimately just determined by our genes, 99% maybe. But that's what I was saying is, like, you have to throw out the concept of a social construct entirely to say that gender isn't a social construct. Gender is a spectrum, by the way, but that's also just a consequence of it not being a binary. Anything that isn't a binary is by default a spectrum, but whatever.
Generally speaking, there's this attempt to separate sex from gender, biological sex from gender being presumably the set of attributes that we typically assume to be more female or more male, that essentially you're talking about masculinity or femininity. Yeah. So first of all, let's define gender, and then let's discuss what in gender is in fact a social construct and what is not, because the idea that masculinity and femininity are completely separable from biological sex is not supported by the science.
Right. So gender identity refers to how we feel.
They wouldn't have to be completely separable, as in uninfluenced in no cases, like as in not influenced in any cases, for them to be social constructs. Social constructs just refer to things that are done socially, like what clothes you choose to wear, etc. Right? Like, as I say, like, you would have to throw out the concept of anything being socially constructed and look at the world look at us just as meat puppets or whatever, being driven deterministically by our genes. Like, you can make that argument, but like within the framework that I think most people understand, where like culture does exist, environment does have an influence on us, like this is of course an easy social construct. I understand that like sex being a social construct, that's a harder argument to swallow because it's more complicated, it's a little more abstract, philosophical, whatever. But like gender, like Jesus, like this is so easy.
With relation to our biological sex, so whether we feel masculine or feminine, and then gender expression is an extension of that, which is how we express our gender identity. So again, most people are gender typical. So if you're male, you're going to be masculine, and if you're female, you're going to be feminine. The second part of your question was referring to which aspects are socially constructed and which are biological. So again, it all comes down to biology and exposure to testosterone in the womb. So higher levels of exposure to testosterone are associated with more male typical interests and male gender expression. So this is regardless of what someone's biological sex is. So this goes the same for females who may be gender atypical.
Wait, what does masculine testosterone having an influence on your personality have to do with whether or not sex or gender are socially constructed?
Again, are more likely on average to be exposed to higher levels of testosterone in utero.
So when it comes to transgenderism, which apparently has become the real hot button here.
Wouldn't that be an environmental influence, testosterone? Anyway.
That men exist and women exist, and a man cannot become a woman, nor can a woman become a man biologically. This is unsayable. If you say this sort of thing, then you put yourself in danger of being actually banned from Twitter. So can, in fact...
I'm pretty sure that's not true. I'm pretty sure you can say that on Twitter, provided you don't include any, unsavory remarks about, transgender people along with them. Also, can we just stick to the philosophy and not do the we're being so oppressed kind of? You're not oppressed, my dude. You're saying it right now. You're saying it to 500,000 people. You're okay.
Man become a woman or a woman become a man, biologically speaking? Or are we just talking about people who are suffering, when we talk about transgender people who are suffering from gender dysphoria, which is a legitimate mental condition?
Me personally, I have no issue referring to trans people using the pronouns they want. I will, if a trans woman would like me to consider her to be female, I will. But that is within the caveat of there are differences between someone who is born female and someone who is a transgender woman. And similarly for trans men and men.
That's so vague. The differences? Well, of course there are differences. The question is whether the differences mean, there are differences among cisgender women. There are differences among women who aren't transgender, but we still consider them women. So there are differences between trans and cisgendered women. We can still consider them women. Okay.
Born male, but the thing is, as you say, we can't even talk about these differences, and I think
you
that's
are
really
talking about
to
it.
Society, because one, for trans rights, and I am in favor of transgender rights. I think for these communities, if they want to be taken seriously and to have their concerns heard, they can't be promoting narratives that are not based in fact and reality, because people are not going to take it seriously.
Like what?
So in your book, you go through a series of myths, among them that gender is a social construct. So when you talk about gender identity or gender expression, why isn't gender a social construct? Why isn't it completely separate from biology?
Well, basically all of the research literature shows
social construct doesn't mean it's completely separate, as in uninfluenced by biology in any way.
Is biological. We can look at a couple of different areas. So one area in particular is girls with a genetic condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So they are exposed to higher than usual levels of testosterone in the womb. And when they are born, they gravitate toward male typical toys and male typical behavior, even when their parents give them more praise for playing with female typical toys. So this speaks to the fact that biology really is a very strong influence, and the idea that gender is socialized by parents and caregivers and teachers and the media and society.
To be clear, I can't speak to the efficacy of that study. What toys you're interested in also is influenced by what toys you're given and what toys you're allowed to play with or encouraged to play with. But regardless, you would be talking about an environmental influence here, no? Of testosterone, not a strictly genetic influence. Okay.
Or whatever else is just not true.
So let's talk about some of the differences, putting aside the transgender issues, just between men and women more generally. So in your book, you talk about actual differences between men and women. What are the differences that we should, of course, we're speaking about on average, because there are people at the tail ends of sort of masculinity and femininity who may have some similar attributes. But when we're talking about the average man versus the average woman, what are the differences that we should take note of? And
Wait, if we're speaking about averages, then you agree it's a social construct based on averages, not some essential scientific reality, right?
Or in sort of our social science analysis.
One area that I'm particularly concerned about is with how this plays out in dating and sex, especially for young people. They're receiving a lot of mixed messages from the media in terms of what to expect in their romantic relationships, how to go about dating. And especially for young women, I feel like they're being told a lot of nonsensical ideas, like they should behave like men in terms of their interactions with men, that they should enjoy casual sex as much as men. And I think, it's whatever floats your boat, I'm totally cool with.
People aren't being told to do this. They're just being told it's okay if you want to.
But if you feel the pressure to behave in a way that is not comfortable for you or that you don't actually enjoy, I feel like young people are just so confused and there's so much misinformation. And I know that you often will give advice to your listeners. So I definitely think that fact-based information is the way to go, especially dating is difficult enough as is.
So let's talk for a second about some of the myths that have been put out there in the social sciences with regard to basically by ignoring differences between men and women. You can come up with these bizarre statistics suggesting that women are wildly discriminated against in American society. Here I'm thinking mostly about the wage gap and the suggestion that because men and women have
What is this, 2010? We're really going to argue about the wage gap?
Significantly different preferences in terms of the kind of jobs that they like and the number of hours they want to work. That this is just
I'm sorry, you're 10 years late to this conversation, man.
Reflection of society's bias against females. Do you talk in the book, the End of Gender, Debunking the Myths About Sex and Identity in Our Society, about the differences between men and women in terms of some of the choices that they make about family and about career and how this actually impacts things like average income?
I do, to the extent of women on average preferring to have a work-life balance, and that the fact that we're not actually having this conversation in a very honest way, and that we're blaming any sort of discrepancy or difference we see in terms of the sex ratio on sexism, I think is actually
okay. So when we say that the discrepancy is due to sexism, this doesn't necessarily mean just the boss looking at the applicant and saying, "Oh, you're a woman. I think women are less intelligent. I'm not going to hire you." The question is, okay, if there's a discrepancy, is it explained by a genetic difference between men and women in terms of the kinds of interests they're going to have? If so, how would you possibly demonstrate it? And what kinds of interests are women encouraged to develop as they grow up? And if women are in fact, even if women are in fact choosing to enter less, say, high-paying fields or less currently high-paying fields, you still have to ask, why are they making that choice? And if they're not making it because of some genetic influence, then it must be because of social encouragement. Because there would be no other explanation unless you think things just happen magically, spontaneously for no reason. And then the question would be, should we change the way we, deal with gender and deal with children, so that that discrepancy doesn't happen? From what I've gathered from these people's conversation, it doesn't seem like they really care about the philosophical question of what a social construct is. It seems like they acknowledge that it is a social construct, that these are average differences, but we should be prescriptively in society encouraging people to move in the direction of adhering more closely to a traditional gender binary, because they have independent reasons for thinking that would be better or more moral or better for the individuals involved. If that's their position, they should argue it as such, because that's all I can glean from where this conversation has ended up. Okay.
Women, because it's not helping them make informed decisions that are actually going to help them live more meaningful and content lives. So one area that I do write and speak quite often about is
this isn't about whether gender is a social construct. It's a social construct, fine, and we should be encouraging the traditional gender roles aspect of that social construct harder, because because they believe it'll be better. That's their position, right? Not that it isn't a social construct.
Sex ratio in STEM, and the fact that it is not a 50-50 ratio. However, it is not due to sexism. Again, it's due to occupational differences on averages, which again go back to...
Which can be due to sexism, systemic sexism, yeah.
On average, exposure...
Or genes, maybe, but you have to demonstrate that.
To prenatal testosterone in terms of what we find interesting. And I think it's really patronizing and infantilizing to say that women who choose to pursue different priorities in their life from men are somehow oppressed.
So, Dr. Soh, you obviously are not somebody who would...
No, not necessarily every individual woman, right? If she's happy with her choice, but that, like, do we even have to use the word oppressed here? I mean, you can, but I don't know, socially discouraged from entering fields that happen to be more highly valued. Like, yeah, that is a kind of oppression. Whether you're happy with your choice or not, right? Like, from the individual's point of view is irrelevant to the question of whether we should be changing this on a societal level.
Consider herself, I think, on the conservative side of the political aisle. I mean, you used to write...
But to be fair, I mean, like, we also shouldn't just be encouraging all women, regardless of what preferences they appear to have, to be pursuing those careers that will most offset the gender imbalance, because that could lead also to unhappiness, especially in the short term for people. But I don't think we're doing that to a significant degree, or at least I don't think we're doing it to a degree greater than the force in the other direction that pushes women towards certain kinds of caretaking jobs over higher paying, more individually driven jobs, right? Like, okay.
Playboy, like, you're not somebody who would fall comfortably into like the center of the Republican Party, and yet you've sort of been treated that way by a huge swath of the media, certainly the Twitterati, people for saying some of these
people don't treat you based on what your exact positions are. They treat you based on which side you further. Like, what narrative do you further? Which centers of power do your contributions to the discourse like embolden and enable? Of course, because it's about the impact that you have on the world, not what's going on in your private thoughts. Anyway, brief aside, but yeah, of course, like that makes total sense.
Basic truths. You've been treated as sort of a social outcast in many ways. Can you talk a little bit about the reaction and why it is that the radical left seems to have taken so much control in areas of science?
No.
Yeah, I have to.
Because she's wrong empirically. She's been kind of vague about what she believes. She hasn't said anything. She hasn't said, like, her positions on gender are just not backed up. We haven't gone enough into transgender people to start showing what bullshit she would start to say about them. But like, yeah, like if she's outcast from the scientific community, that's also a separate question from why she would be disliked by like the political left. But yeah.
To say thank you so much, Ben, for all of your support over the years. I mean, you would retweet some of my columns for Playboy, so I really appreciate that. You know, I still comment.
You're getting retweeted by Ben Shapiro. Yeah, like no wonder the political left doesn't like you. All right, well, this is my video on gender. We'll probably talk more about it in the future. Debra Soh is an idiot who enables the right. Clearly, all right, we're done.